Well, good evening. It's good to see you guys. Welcome back. If you happened to miss last week, it's okay. It's recorded. I sent you all an email just a little bit ago with that link as well, so you guys can find it. This one will be recorded as well, so you can catch up if you missed last week. In case you are new this week and you don't know me, my name is Lorian Hook. I'm the Adult Studies Director here at MDPC, and you are embarking on week 2 of a 3-week class called The World of the New Testament, where we're talking about common misconceptions, different things that are important to know about entering the New Testament. Predominantly, we're talking about the Gospels here, but it applies to other New Testament texts and time periods as well. So last week, we kind of did an overview of, hey, what happens between the Old Testament and the New Testament historically, because it's really important for us to understand that, because the world of the New Testament does not just pick up in perfect step right where the Old Testament left off. Several hundreds of years have passed, right? And several different historical things have happened that are key to note and that have set up where we start when we get to the Gospels, when we get to the kind of the opening of the New Testament for us. And so that's what we did last week. And I told you last week that we're going to talk about a few different things tonight and next week. We're going to focus on about 3 different things that are important, that come up a lot in the New Testament, that we tend to get wrong or that we tend to miss. So tonight we're going to talk about the law. We're going to talk about Torah. I might be able to get into Pharisees a little bit later. If not, we'll do Pharisees, and then we'll do Pharisees and demons next week, right? So it's law, Pharisees, and demons are things that we don't really catch sometimes, like, oh yeah, those things are there when we read, especially again, the Gospels, right? These things are present there, but we have been so kind of conditioned and we're so familiar with the text, which is both a good and a bad thing, right? It's great that you know the Bible. It's great that you know the stories of the New Testament, right? Praise God. But there also is this danger that comes with that, which is an overfamiliarity, right? Or just letting misconceptions that we heard when we were 12 or we heard when we were 57 or we heard, from some preacher somewhere once that have just kind of stuck with us and we never learn better, right? And so that's kind of the goal of what we're trying to do. So tonight I want to talk about the law because as Protestants and specifically even as Gentiles, as non-Jews, we tend to have a negative view of the law, perhaps a neutral view of the law at best, right? It tends to be, the law is gone, or it's dead, or it's ineffective, or it only served to show people how sinful they are, and all these things, which not so actually. There's misconceptions we get specifically with 1 or 2 verses from Paul, and then just typical things that we get wrong because we have all these things about the law that we've been taught or that we've heard or we've just kind of assumed because we're so far removed from it. And we really need to understand what's happening with the law if we're going to understand how Jesus interacts with it in the New Testament. And then how Paul himself also interacts with it, because Paul interacts with it quite a bit. So to kind of jumpstart that, what I want to do is I want to go over 4 common misconceptions about the law. Okay? So 4 common misconceptions about the law to kind of jumpstart our conversation. The first is that obeying the law somehow earns you right standing with God. Obeying the law earns you right standing with God, or earns you your way to God, right? So again, these are misconceptions. Please note that in your notes, that these are misconceptions. Don't make a list of these 4 things and be like, well, that's what she said. No, misconceptions, please, head it, big capital letters in red, heading. These are misconceptions about the law. And what I'm going to do is I'll do each one at a time and kind of give you some reasoning behind. I'm not going to be able to unpack each of these at length, right? I could do an hour-long thing on each one of these, right? So the purpose of this 3-week class is to kind of get your feet wet. It's just kind of like a little sample. So misconception 1, that the law somehow gains you access to God, or is a way that you earn your way to God, or something along those lines. There's different ways of saying that, but you guys understand kind of the thrust of what I'm saying. For the reason that this is not the case is actually quite simple, and I can explain it to you. It doesn't earn you God's favor to follow the law. It doesn't earn you some sort of right standing with God. It doesn't earn God's aid for you. It doesn't earn God's ear to bend towards your prayers if you follow the law, because the law doesn't come about until after the Exodus. So the people that God rescues, that he gives the law to, have done nothing prior to him giving them the law to earn their way to him hearing them, other than just simply existing as his people. They don't have the law. Abraham doesn't have the law. Isaac doesn't have the law. Jacob doesn't have the law. We don't get the law until post-Exodus. And God rescues his people who actually, by the time the Exodus rolls around, probably are polytheists and don't really even know him all that well, because they've been in Egypt for 400 years. Not really, there's no law to keep them intact. There's no law to keep them kind of in these boundaries, right? And God rescues them anyway and brings them out of Egypt and then gives them the law. There's not this expectation of, hey, get your act together, do things right, and then I'll bless you, and then I'll move you out of slavery, and then I'll do something for you. No, the law is actually the gift of the Exodus. So the law is not this burdensome thing. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But they don't earn their way to God by following the law. God has already told them, hey, I want to dwell in your midst. That's one of the huge reasons, that's one of the resounding themes we get that leads us to the Exodus and throughout the Exodus. One of the reasons God rescues his people is he says, I want to dwell in your midst. I want to dwell among you. You will be my people. I will be your God. We get this language over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament. And so the law is actually the gift of the Exodus, whereby the people are able, through the gift of the law, to make that happen. God gives them instructions for the tabernacle in the law. God tells them, here's how you maintain purity and holiness, which we'll talk more about in a second. All of these things are means by which we maintain what I've already given you. You're not doing these things so that I'll then do something. I'm already doing it. So the law is a gift. It's not some rule book that they have to follow in order to get God to do what they want God to do, or in order to earn God's favor, or in order to get God to act on their behalf. God has already acted on their behalf through the Exodus and through a multiplicity of other things. And he gives them the law to say, here's how we maintain this. The law doesn't get God to do what they want him to do. Okay? Again, we could talk about that at length, but just FYI. The second, again, misconception, is that the law demands perfection and is impossible to keep. The second misconception is that the law demands perfection and is impossible to keep. My friends, this is simply not true. Built into the law itself are ways for you to fix and to remain in covenant, to remain following the law when you do mess up. It expects, the law anticipates the people's inability to do this 24/7. And it says, that's not a problem. Here's how you fix that. Here's how you offer sacrifice. Here's how you, once a year, purify all of the holy, the sancta, the holy places. Here's how you do that. It doesn't say, here's all the things you have to do, and there's no way to fix it if you ever mess up. Good luck. Right? Built into the law itself are ways to maintain it. Are ways for you, not for you personally, but pretend you're Israel for a second, for you, Israel, to remain in covenant, to remain under the law. Nowhere does it expect perfection. Nowhere does it demand, hey, you can't mess up at all. It says you're going to contract impurity, which we'll talk about in a second. Sin is going to pile up on the altars that has to be eradicated, which is what Yom Kippur is for. All of these things are built into the law, thereby signaling to us that perfection is actually not expected. It's not impossible. It's not this burden. It's a gift. And I think that is the big shift that's going to have to happen in our thinking about the law. It's not a burden, it's a gift. So one, the law is not your way of earning your way to God or getting God to do what you want. Two, the law it does not demand perfection. It's not impossible to keep, actually. It simply is not. Nowhere in the law do we get an indication that this is impossible. It's very practical. The third thing is that, and this is, if you did my last 3-week class on kind of the sacrificial system and the Levitical system, you know this. The third misconception is that impurity equals sin. Again, this is a misconception. that impurity, when the law talks about impurity, that somehow equates with sin, this is simply not true. This is simply not true. And here's where in the Gospels most of us get this idea from. We've been told, I've taught this before I actually knew what I was doing. So, which again, if you have people stand before you who don't say, I was wrong, they need to probably. I've taught this before, and I was wrong. So when Jesus, for example, when the woman with the issue of blood, right? Remember that story? She touches Jesus' robe. How many of us have had it been made a big deal about this, that, oh, how dare she's impure, and now she's transferred her impurity to Jesus, and oh my gosh, this is a huge deal. Or that Jesus stoops down and he actually touches people with leprosy, or he touches dead bodies and he contracts their impurity, and oh my gosh, this is how crazy is that? It's not crazy actually, because being in a state of impurity does not equate with sin. So Jesus is not somehow contracting someone else's sin by touching someone who's in a state of impurity. How do we know that impurity doesn't equal sin? Because of the ways in which you become impure. For example, you contract impurity if you bury a dead body, if you touch a dead body. Is that sin? No, unless you're the high priest. The high priest is not allowed to do that. The priests actually can. The high priest is not allowed to contract corpse impurity. So is it sinful to be impure from that? No. Is it sinful for a woman to menstruate? No. Is it sinful to have relations in a marriage? No. Is it sinful for a woman to give birth? No. All of these things are ways in which you contract impurity according to the Levitical law, according to Torah, according to the law. None of these things are sinful. None of them are. So to say that to be in a state of impurity equates with sin is simply not true. Now, what can become sinful is if you don't deal with your impurity properly according to the certain things you're supposed to do, the washing, the making offerings, celebration offerings sometimes of that nature. That becomes a problem. But to simply be in a state of impurity is not sinful. It's not a problem. Most people, most of the time, probably were in some form of a state of impurity. That's just being around other human beings. You touch a woman who's menstruating, guess what? You're impure now. It happened everyone is mostly impure probably most of the time. What happens where it becomes an issue is when you try to go to the tabernacle or the temple to make offerings and enter the holy presence of God and the holy places, and you haven't dealt with your impurity through the washing and stuff before going to the tabernacle. Okay? So the law does not equate impurity with sin. So this is a huge misconception that we have to get right. This even happens in The Chosen. They make a huge deal about Jesus touching someone who's impure, right? And I'm no, it's wrong. It's not a big deal to touch someone who has an impurity. It's not sinful, which is again why the law has these built-in ways to deal with it. It's not sinful. The law says, hey, it's going to happen. You're human. That's how your bodies work. All these things, right? Here's how you deal with it. So again, the being impure does not equate with sin. Being impure does not equate with sin. Okay, misconception number 4. And this is the last of the misconceptions that we'll talk about. There are several others, but these are kind of the 4 big ones. The fourth is that the law excludes Gentiles. Again, misconception. The law excludes Gentiles. Again, this is simply not true. Gentiles were actually welcomed into the Israelite community, even in the Old Testament. There are ways, multiple ways, in Leviticus and elsewhere laid out in the Old Testament whereby Gentiles can live with the Jews, can be part of their community, can even participate in certain festivals that the law dictates, that they even are allowed to offer offerings at the tabernacle and temple when appropriate according to the law. The law does not isolate Israel as this kind of sectarian community that says no one else can come in and no one else can ever be part of what we're doing here and no one else can even touch the law. No, the law actually makes provision for this. The law makes provision for Gentiles to participate in it and to be a part of what's going on. You could even become ethnically Jewish, especially if you're a male, by circumcision and then by taking on all of the Torah practices. This was allowed. This was done. This is one of the things that Paul contends against in the New Testament. So it's not that the law excludes Gentiles. No, the law is a gift given specifically to Israel, but not at the expense of other people being welcomed in, should they choose, or should they want to remain as Gentiles, but still live in the Israelite community, worship Israel's God, all those types of things, okay? So 4 misconceptions that kind of help us think hopefully more clearly, or at least kind of get them on the table. It might still be a little fuzzy right now, and that's okay, but we need to have these things kind of at least in our brains when we talk about the law. Because again, unfortunately for most of us, the law is neutral at best, sometimes even thought of in a negative light at worst, and it's not. Again, it's a gift that God gives to his people Israel, whereby which they are able to maintain covenant relationship with him, so that he already has said he will live in their midst, will continue to do so. It is a gift that God gives to his people. Okay, now let me kind of get us more into the New Testament. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from a book that I'm going to recommend to you all. I know some of you have actually read this. This is a book, it's called Mind the Gap. Mind the Gap by Matthias Henze. It is very readable. It's written for his undergrad classes. He's a professor at Rice. Great biblical scholar. Matthias is solid, knows his stuff really well. Highly recommend this book called Mind the Gap. It's very readable. Again, it's written for undergrad level reading. Like it's not super academic. There's not footnotes. Like it's very easy to read. And he deals with kind of what we talked about last week a little bit of connecting the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then introduces us to key things in the world of the New Testament. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from him that kind of get us from the law in the Old Testament to the New Testament. And then we're going to talk about what does Torah, what does law mean, all those things. So hang in there while I read from this. Here he goes. He says, did Jesus abolish the law of Moses? He says, during my presentations on Jesus and the law in several churches, I was struck by 2 sentiments that I heard repeatedly from people in the audience. The first, at the time of Jesus, Jews had a rather narrow understanding of the law. Again, this is a misconception. Their religious lives were largely organized around the interpretation of and strict obedience to the law, which they took to an extreme. And the second sentiment, Jesus overcame this form of religion and freed his followers from the law. Jesus abolished the law and replaced it with love and common sense. He called on people to follow the golden rule and to love God and neighbor, which after all is much more sensible than following a primitive set of antiquated rules. Why do so many Christians today believe that Jews at the time of Jesus were fixated on the law? One reason is the way in which the evangelists, that's the authors of the 4 Gospels, write about the debates between Jesus and the Pharisees in the Gospels. Far from being described in a neutral and objective manner, the Pharisees often come across as narrow-minded, hostile, and scheming. They are the bad guys, the opponents of Jesus. In these short scenes in the Gospels, the Pharisees tend to serve as a foil against which Jesus' response seems like a breath of fresh air. From here, it is only a small step for the modern reader of the New Testament to think that if this is what the Pharisees thought about the law, then truly all Jews must think the same. Another reason for the negative view is that all too often, stereotypical perceptions of rabbinic Judaism of a much later time, and particularly of the rabbis' alleged understanding of Judaism as a religion of the law, are read back into the time of Jesus. Last paragraph. There are many problems with this sentiment. One is that the gospel writers were simply not interested in giving us an objective description of the Pharisees. Their main objective was to show that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel. The actual Pharisees who lived in the New Testament times were much more complex as a group, and their views significantly more refined than what we learn about them in the New Testament. Another problem is that the Pharisees were not all of Judaism at the time of Jesus. They were only one of many groups, and each group had its own understanding of the law. It is therefore grossly misleading to draw any conclusions from Jesus' legal debates with the Pharisees, particularly as they are cast in the Gospels, about Jewish attitudes towards the law in general. Finally, we need to be careful not to project later forms of Judaism back into the time of Jesus. Quite apart from the fact that this is anachronistic, such projections are all the more problematic when the perception of Jewish attitude towards the law that is being projected is itself pejorative and questionable. It's a lot of reading to basically say a couple things. One, he's arguing, we're going to talk more about the Pharisees next week, but he's arguing that the way that in which we understand how Jesus interacts with the law in the Gospels is painted through a very specific lens, which it is. The Gospel writers had purposes for why they wrote. They were writing to specific audiences with specific things in mind, and so they're not overly interested in painting the Pharisees in the best light, right? That's not what they're concerned with. They're concerned with juxtaposing Jesus as Israel's Messiah, who's misunderstood, who the religious leaders reject. That's really what they're getting at, is demonstrating the religious leaders reject Jesus to their detriment, right? And we see that played out in Jesus' trial and crucifixion. Matthias is also making us aware of the reality that much later, after the second temple is destroyed in 70 AD, there's no more temple, right? So the law and understanding the law and understanding how Israel functions becomes kind of shaky because we don't have a temple, we don't have the sacrificial system, we don't have all of these things. So the rabbinic schools, where the schools of the rabbis really begin to take off after that time. And then typically what we equate with Judaism in the New Testament is actually a much later version of Judaism, simply because of how we've been taught, which is unfortunate, but it's true. So, to that end, I want to talk now about what exactly does law or Torah mean, and how does that get brought forward into the New Testament? So Torah is a noun, right? Person, place, thing, or idea, right? It's a noun. But like it's a Hebrew word, and like much Hebrew, it is derived from a verb. It's derived from the verb yarah, which actually has a lot of different meanings. It can mean things like to teach, to instruct, okay? It can mean those things. It can mean this idea of to point out or to show, right? So in its verbal form, it means to teach, to show, to point out, to demonstrate, these types of things, to instruct even. So that gets pulled forward into the idea of Torah as a noun. It's instruction, it's teaching, it's pointing, it's the thing that points things out, that gives us guidance, right? But there's a couple of different ways in which this works. Because, let's be honest, you read Leviticus, you read Deuteronomy, and you get a picture of the law. I'm not going to say you get a version of the law. You get a picture of the law. In that it's very like black and white. You do this, you don't do this. It's rule, rule, rule. Those types of things, right? And then you read passages like this. So if you have your Bible, feel free to open as well. Open your Bible up to the book of Psalms. We're going to jump around a little bit and see how other places deal with the idea of Torah, of law, right? So instruction, guidance, teaching, pointing out, showing. We get a version or a picture of the law, again, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Again, those are the books that are really boring for us to read, right? Because we're like, oh my word. And most of us leave our experience with those books thinking, man, I'm glad I don't have to do that, right? Okay, fair enough, right? But look at how the law is also depicted. So Psalm chapter 1 says, blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked or stand in the way of sinners or sit in the company of mockers or scoffers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on this law they meditate day and night. And we sit here and we're like, hold on just a second. So they're meditating, if we're reading this very flatly, what most of us think is, they're meditating on the sacrificial system, and it's giving them delight. Like they're meditating on how to restore purity after giving birth, and that is giving them delight. No. This is a much more poetic kind of take on the idea that law or Torah, because that's the word we get here, Torah, the law of the Lord. On this law they meditate day and night. It's much more of a way that leads to wisdom. They viewed the law, they viewed Torah as rules, to be sure. That's what they are. But if I can use this language, the essence, the spirit of Torah is to lead to wisdom, is to lead to right living, is to lead to flourishing in the land that God has given them. And And we get this a little bit highlighted by Jesus. Jesus is not doing anything new. FYI, in Matthew, when we have Sermon on the Mount, we get this little opening part, right? Then we get the Beatitudes. And then we get these like contrarian statements that most of us unfortunately have been taught are Jesus like usurping the law or like showing that he's like stronger or better than the law, right? He says, you've heard it said X, but I tell you Y, right? We get this multiple places, right? So for example, we get the whole, you've heard it said, do not murder. But if you think about or consider your brother or your sister and you have anger in your heart towards them, you've committed murder, right? We also get some stuff in there about, he does this a couple of different times, right? And sometimes most of us, unfortunately, have been taught that this is Jesus like flipping the law on its head and saying, oh, it's not the law the way you've understood it, the law the way it's been taught, or the law the way it is only concerned with your outward actions and is only concerned with you living correctly and doesn't focus on the heart. This is simply not true. The way I know this is not true is a couple ways. One, just two kind of low-hanging fruit examples. One of the Ten Commandments, if you think about it, is you shall not commit adultery, right? You shouldn't do this, which implies as well, because Jesus also grabs this one and brings it forward, it implies that you have to have some sort of like internal thing happening before an outward action takes place. So the law is in fact concerned with your internal kind of way of being in the world. It's concerned with how you think and how you act in your heart. We also get language that says in the Old Testament that Jesus then again pulls forward. He's not doing anything new. It tells us in the Old Testament, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And we get this is not a law that is the law is not only concerned with outward action. It's not only concerned with you outwardly being obedient to a list of rules. It is concerned with the matters of the heart, the matters of your soul. And in ancient Near Eastern Judaism, and even as we get pulled forward into Second Temple Judaism, the way of talking about this is wisdom. Living rightly. Being wise, which is why we have a whole genre in the Old Testament called wisdom literature. Right? We have Ecclesiastes, we have Proverbs, we have Job, we have Song of Solomon. These are what get put under the head of wisdom literature. Which is why even Psalm chapter 1 opens, the first book of the Psalter says, hey, if you live rightly, if you're meditating on God's law, this leads to life. The author of the Psalms doesn't say it leads to you following a bunch of rules or it leads to you feeling like bound up or like you can't do anything, right? It says it leads to life. It leads to good things. So let's flip over to Psalm 110, which is kind of the big psalm about the law. It's one of the big ones that we get. I'm sorry, did I say 110? Yeah. I meant 119. I was like, that's not right. That's not right. Psalm 119 is the big psalm about the law, right? It's long. It's an acronym. It goes through like the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. Like it's beautiful, and it's all about the law. And if we only understand the law as a rule book, or as something concerned with outward action, or as something only concerned with maintaining purity, so that God will do something for us, so that all of these different things that we talked about a minute ago, then we miss the very Israelite, the very Jewish understanding of the law as something that leads to wisdom. The law is something that leads to right living. For example, Psalm 119, verse 1, blessed are those whose way are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his statutes and seek him with all their heart. Again, this is not an action-based only agenda. This is not a rule book necessarily in and of itself. That's not the only way to think of it. This is not burdensome in the way that I unfortunately most of us have been instructed to think about the law. It's not burdensome. That wasn't the way that they came to understand it. It's a gift. It's how you remain in covenant. And why wouldn't you want to remain in covenant? There's blessing. You're in the good land flowing with milk and honey, like that God has given you before the covenant or before the law even. He said, this is where I'm going to put you. So it's not this burden. It's not this impossible thing that doesn't make sense or that is in no way doable. It is a gift. It's a gift. Now, we have a few different things about the law as well that we need to consider. For example, Deuteronomy, in its final form, the form that we have and the way that it was finally redacted and put together and then kind of maintained, probably didn't happen until around the Babylonian exile. So we have issues with exactly what is the law, because remember that story about King Josiah, right? And you have the king who they're doing some renovations or some housekeeping on the temple, and they find this book, right? And they're like, oh dear, oh dear. So they rush it to the king, and he reads it, and he's distraught because he's like, this is what we're supposed to be doing? We have not been doing this. And he consults the priest, he consults the prophetess Huldah, right? And they're both like, yeah, we need to get on this, right? And so for us to think that somehow God gave the law to Moses, which he did, that's what we have recounted to us in places like Deuteronomy and elsewhere. God gives the law to Moses, and then that somehow it just remains unbroken for however long, and that the people just follow it without any further instruction, without any, just for ages, is a misnomer. There seems to be gaps where the people are just off doing all kinds of stuff. Even in the book of Judges, we get this, right? Everyone does what's right in their own eyes, which is the great resounding accusation that Judges brings against the people. They're off doing all these crazy things, and there doesn't seem to be, until we get to Ezra, really, anyone who is like Moses, who says, this is the law, this is what God has given us, and we must remain faithful to it. We have these weird gaps where the people just seem to be kind of off doing whatever. Now, the caveat to that is there's always a faithful few. There's always those who have stayed near to the temple, right? We even get this in the time of Jesus. We get Anna the prophetess, we get Simeon, people who have stayed near to the temple, who have stayed near to what God has instructed them. Maybe they had really good parents and grandparents. We don't know, right? You get someone even like Timothy, who had a great grandmother, a great mother who instructed him. But if you don't have that, you don't have a copy of the law at home. You're only going to hear it if you actually, one, go to the temple or go to the tabernacle, depending on which period of time we're talking about. And second, you're only going to hear it if there are good priests and high priests in office who are actually following what they're supposed to be doing and reading the Torah once every X amount of years to you. So there's this shift that we have to have happen in our thinking. They didn't have their pocket Torah at home, right? They didn't have it on their phones. They didn't have a family Bible, right? It didn't exist. They're only hearing it at this point in time. They're only hearing it once every 7 years. Again, that's if you have good priests and high priests in office. And that's if you have good parents and grandparents, which is again why Deuteronomy says, hey, parents, you need to talk about these things when you go out, when you come in, when you lie down, when you rise up, because the onus is on you, on the community. Because not everyone has a pocket Torah, right? It'd be really big if you did. It'd be a big one. It'd weigh you down. So not everyone has this, right? So again, it's a communal thing. So again, these are just misconceptions that we have, understandably so. It's so weird for us to think in these terms, right? But they didn't have that. And so you have people like the king, you have Josiah, and they find the scroll, and he institutes all these reforms. And he's like, get it together. And they do. And for a while, they're on track. And then you kind of do what you want to do, and you get some priests in there who aren't really concerned with it. You get a king who's not overly concerned with being faithful, and no one hears about it for a while. And you kind of know rumors of it, and you kind of know, yeah, we're supposed to do that one thing, so let's do that one thing. But it's not maintained well, which again, leads to exile. It leads to exile. And so after exile, we get Ezra and Nehemiah. And this is where we have a big shift in thinking about the law. This is where we get like the law as statutory. So you kind of have like with Deuteronomy and with Moses, you have like the legal meaning of the law. You have the kind of like mind your P's and Q's, here's the essence of the law, here's what we actually are instructed, and it's more legal in thought. Not until we get to Ezra specifically does the law take on this like statutory essence for the people. This kind of like prescriptive way of living that defines life. That's kind of what I mean by statutory. It's prescriptive. It's something they are supposed to follow. There's this massive shift in thinking, which is why Ezra is kind of heralded as this new Moses. He's kind of heralded, especially once you get into Second Temple Jewish literature, he's heralded as this great figure who restored or who brought about these reforms. Right? You get Nehemiah and that crew, they go back and rebuild the temple. And we have that whole situation happen. But then Ezra really steps in and says, hey, this is now going to define how we live in this space in a new and different way than it previously had, because the way we were doing it before led to exile, and that didn't work. So we need to rethink this. Again, we tend to have, again, all of this is understandable why we think this, but we have to work against that. It's understandable that we just assume that, Moses gets the law, and then we march through history, and they've just followed it, and they all know it, and then, they just decide, they're like, no, we're not going to do that, and then we pick right back up, and it's the same thing. No, they're people, and they're different, they're moving, they've been in different cultures, they've been in exile, they're different people than their ancestors were, just like you are. You don't follow the Bible and believe the same things about the Bible, I guarantee you don't, that your grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-grandparents did. You simply don't. Now, some of it's the same. Praise God. Especially if you had faithful grandparents and great-grandparents who were Christians. Praise God. Not everyone does. But if you do, I guarantee you do not believe the same things that they did about the Bible and how it works. You go back far enough, like pre-Dead Sea Scrolls, you definitely don't believe the same things about people who lived pre-Dead Sea Scroll discovery, because it was so cataclysmic in how we shifted thinking about different time periods. So the same rules apply to how they would have understood who they were, what they were doing, what the law was, how it functioned. The people of Ezra's time are radically different than the Israelites post-Exodus of Moses' time. Radically different, keep moving forward, than the people in the New Testament. They're not just like this line of continuous thought that never changes. It always is changing. It always is. God, thank the Lord himself, is faithful and consistent and doesn't change. But the people have changed. The way they understand things have changed. They've been through horrible things. They've been through exile. They've seen family members murdered. They've seen family members carted off into slavery. All of these things have happened to them. Some of these people have grown up in captivity. They've never even been to Israel. They've never been to their homeland. They don't even know what the temple is supposed to look like. And so things have happened, things have shifted. And so by the time we get to Ezra, Nehemiah, and then specifically Ezra, the law takes on this new kind of way of being that becomes much more statutory. This is our way of life. This is how things happen. This is who we are. It becomes even more identifying for them as a people group. Because think about it. You've been in exile. You've been under foreign rule. You have no political identity. You have very little economic identity, actually no economic identity. You have very little religious identity. You have very little self-identity. And so the law, Torah, now becomes the way in which they distinguish themselves from everyone else. They say, this is what it means to be one of us, is to follow this. And there's this shift that happens. And it becomes very stringent. It becomes this is what it means. Okay. Jesus, when we get into the New Testament, is encountering several different types of ways of thinking about the Torah, of thinking about the law. And we'll talk more about the Pharisees next week, but think with me for just a second. I'll kind of pregame that a little bit. The Pharisees are one group, And perhaps for our conversation here, the best way to think of it, this is not entirely accurate, but it's going to get us in the ballpark, okay? So roll with me on this. Think of the Pharisees as a denomination. Okay, does that make sense? Like, think of them as a denomination. They're not the ruling, everyone does what they say. They're not the only group. You have the Pharisees, you have Sadducees, you have the Essenes, you have the Zealots. You have all these different, again, for lack of a better word or idea, congregations, all of which are Jews, all of which follow the law, all of which think their way of following the law is the right way of following the law. Sounds like our denominations, right? It's exactly what we do, right? We look back and we're like, oh my goodness, they just couldn't agree, they couldn't figure it out, and here we sit in a Presbyterian church, and the Methodist church is right there, and the Baptist church is there, so we do the same thing, right? So they all think that their way of following Torah, of following the law, is the way. That's the one way to do it. So this is the world that Jesus steps into. And along with their varying degrees and their varying ways of following Torah and the things that they want to highlight above other things, along with that comes expectations for what God is doing, how God is going to rescue them, and what God's Messiah is going to be like. All of them have some similar views, but there's also some variations in there. Because they're reading the law, they're reading Torah, they're reading Israel's history slightly differently, just like our denominations do when we read the scriptures and we have disagreements on theological topics, ways of considering things, etc. Again, it doesn't quite, like the correlation doesn't quite lock in, but it gets us in the ballpark of thinking about this kind of world. So Jesus, again, comes on the scene in Matthew chapter 5. Let's open up to Matthew chapter 5. I've already hinted at this a little bit. Matthew 5, we get his great Sermon on the Mount. And again, we start with this tiny little introduction, and then we get the Beatitudes, which are beautiful and fantastic and challenging and confusing in some ways. But the Beatitudes, for lack of a better, just because I don't have time, paint what it looks like to live in the kingdom. It's painting some form of eschatological hope that God is going to set things right and that these are the people who really truly belong in the kingdom, who get it. Okay? And then we have a few different kinds of parables that we get, or some sayings about salt and light, those types of things. And then we get to, again, these contrarian statements where Jesus really interacts with the law. And what does he say? Verse 21, Matthew chapter 5. We get the, you've heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder. He's quoting Exodus 20. To the people long ago are your ancestors, the Israelites, back in Moses' time after the Exodus. That's who he's referencing. He says, so you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. He's quoting the law. He's quoting Torah. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And we're like, oh my. Jesus is saying things that aren't in the law, like he's expanding it, or he's making it more personal, or he's making it even harder or whatever. Yes, it's hard, but he's not adding anything. He's not saying anything different than we get in the law, because there's actually passages in the Old Testament, in the law, that say, you shall not hate your brother or your sister. It's in Torah. He's reminding them, in some ways, Jesus is making it harder. Not by saying something that's not in Torah, not by saying something that's not the law, but by reminding them that the actual essence of the law, back to that idea of wisdom that we talked about, is what it actually is about. Which is what he seems to clash with the Pharisees about some. He's like, you guys are great at like outward stuff. Like you got the rules down, like you do it, but your hearts are a mess. The internal mechanism and the reasoning for this, you seem to have forgotten. So Jesus is not adding anything to the law. Jesus is not kind of saying, oh, let me make it more spiritual than it is because it's just laws and rules. No, he's saying it's always been spiritual. It's always been about the heart. It's always been about relationship with God. Keep going. Verse 27, we get another one of these sayings. You've heard it said, again, he's quoting the law. He's quoting the law of Moses. You shall not commit adultery. Again, 10 Commandments. He's like going easy. Like, this is low-hanging fruit. This isn't even like random commandments from Leviticus. Like, he's just 10 commandments, right? He goes, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Again, this is nothing new. This is actually what Torah is getting at. Jesus is reminding them of the stringency of Torah. Is anywhere in this Jesus telling them to stop following Torah? No. He actually says, what does he say? I've not come to abolish the law. Come to fulfill the law, right? Keep going. We get another one. Just pick another one. Verse 33. Again, you've heard it said that to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, and he goes on and on and on. Again, Jesus is not saying anything new. He's saying this is a heart condition. This is a disposition towards God. This is a way of thinking that leads to wisdom, that's supposed to form wisdom within you. And that is the role of Torah. That's the purpose of Torah. That's the purpose of the law. It's not like a rule book that's like put as a burden on the people. It is a gift that God gives them by which they maintain, by which they live in communion with him, that he's already willing to graciously give them. This is why, again, this idea of wisdom, this idea of right living, this is why at the end of this section in verse 48, Jesus says this. He says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Easy, right? The law is not unbearable. The law does not lack purpose. The law is not just rules that are meant to like show them how bad they are. No, the law is meant to lead to right living and wisdom that only comes from God. We get this multiple times in the law itself. We get this in how Jesus deals with it. Now let me talk in our last couple minutes here a little bit about how Paul deals with it, and I'll circle back to this a little bit next week as well. So I know there might be some lingering questions. Don't worry. I'll try to circle back to this as well. Paul, in the New Testament, says a lot about the law. He has a lot to say about it. Paul is a Jew. We all know this, right? Paul's a Jew. When Paul is converted on the road to Damascus, Paul does not stop being a Jew. He is still a Jew. He's a Christian, but he's a Jew. And those two things in the New Testament are allowed to coincide. You can be a Jew and a Christian in the same way that you can be a Gentile and a Christian. This is part of Paul's mission. He is an apostle to the Gentiles. We have others that are apostles to the Jews, right? And one of Paul's big messages, he tells the people in Romans, we get a little bit of this in Galatians as well. He tells the people, he says that God uniquely chose Israel to be his special people. And he gave them the gift of the law with a host of other gifts as well. But God in his mercy and in this great mystery of salvation, which we get referenced other places in the New Testament as well, has decided and just not like chose like plan B or C, but from the foundations of the earth, that all people will be welcomed in, Gentiles included, that all people will be welcomed in through his plan of salvation through Jesus, right? And Paul affirms this and says, yes. Paul's like, I love this. This is great. Praise God. Paul's like really jazzed up about it, right? He then proceeds to, over the course of several verses, tell people, and we get this idea in other books of the New Testament, where you have Gentile churches who are under threat, or who are being confronted with who we typically call the Judaizers, right? People who said, oh, if you want to be a Christian, if you want to follow Jesus, it's kind of like we had him first, he's one of us, and so if you want to be a Christian, you need to actually become a Jew first. You need to be circumcised, you need to follow the law, all these things, and then you're good to go, right? And Paul says, no, not at all, actually. Paul says, if you're Jewish, stay Jewish. Not once does Paul tell them, stop following the law. Paul himself presumably followed the law, even after he was converted. Because it is as Jews that God's mercy is demonstrated to them, and he says, you remain as Jews. And the flip side of that, Gentiles don't become Jews. He says, remain as Gentiles. Because you Jews existing as Jews and you Gentiles existing as Gentiles demonstrates the breadth of what God has done. And he argues for this. And he says, this is the mystery of what God is doing. And he circles all the way back to Abraham, remember? And he says, Abraham was not circumcised when God first called him. He was a Gentile. He was a pagan, actually. So even if we go back to Abraham, the father of Israel is also the father of the Gentiles, according to Paul's logic. And so Paul tells the Gentiles, don't become Jews. There are two laws from Torah, from the law, that the Jerusalem Council in Acts tells the Gentiles they need to follow. Does anybody know what they are? Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. That's one of them. What's the other one?
Abstain from sexual immorality.
Sexual immorality. Those are the two commandments that the Jerusalem Council kind of gets together, and then Paul echoes this as well, and says, hey, these apply to everyone, which they kind of did already in the Old Testament even. If you wanted to be a part of the Jewish community, if you wanted to be in proximity to what God was doing. That's it. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, which Paul spends a lot of time talking about, mostly because it was involved in the cultic worship of gods and deities and the emperor that were happening in their culture. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, and and keep yourself from sexual immorality. Again, which had a lot to do with cultic worship and temple worship and all these things that were going on. That's it. He doesn't tell the Gentiles, hey, you need to become Jews. And hey, oh, by the way, Jews, you don't suddenly stop being Jews. The law remains intact for the Jews. And Paul does not see this as a bad thing. He doesn't see it as a burden. He sees it as, hey, this is what identifies you as Jews. Again, this idea that sometimes we have to shift in our thinking of the law as gift, the law as relationship, the law as God marking Israel uniquely, right? But Gentiles do not become Jews. Again, Paul argues against this strongly, against the Judaizers, against these people who were wanting to come into these Gentile congregations and say, hey, we hear you got Jesus, but you actually need all of these other things too. And Paul says, no, not so for the Gentiles. Because as Gentiles, they demonstrate God's rich mercy and faithfulness to the nations that was promised thousands of years ago. And Paul says it is necessary, it is good to have both Jews and Gentiles in the family of God. This is part of God's great, mysterious plan. This is part of God's mercy, Paul argues even. And he says this over and over and over again. And he demonstrates multiple times that this is the plan, that this is God's mercy. He doesn't tell the Jews, stop following the law. We get, there's a verse that a lot of people quote about Christ is the end of the law, right? And that's what a lot of people get hung up on. Well, Jesus came and so the law is done, right? We don't follow the law. Christ is the end of the law. I argue, now again, you can have your own thoughts on this. You're totally welcome to do that. That's part of the good thing about thinking. The word for end there is telos in the Greek. Telos can also mean purpose. Telos can mean fulfillment. Telos can mean like the thing that it's been pointing to the whole time. Christ is the thing that the law has been pointing to the whole time. Christ is the thing that is the way forward for the law. Christ is the way that we understand the law fully. I think it's a bad translation to render it Christ is the end of the law. Telos does not mean something ends. It means like the goal of. So it means end, but not in the way that we think of it. It's not like the end, period, close the chapter book, you're done, right? It means like the goal, the purpose, what it's moving toward, you know? And even Jesus himself says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I didn't come to abolish the law. Now, some days I'm not mad. Most days I'm not mad that I don't have to follow the law. There's a lot in there. There's a lot in there that makes things inconvenient. If you know any Orthodox Jews, who actually follow Torah, it's radically inconvenient in some ways, in our perspective. For them, they view it as a gift. They view things like Shabbat, like Sabbath, as a gift. For us, we're like, wow, you have to like not do anything. You're not using like electricity in the way that we use it, for like 24 hours. You're not doing anything, like no electronic, like all these things. And we're like, oh my word. For them, it's a gift. I think that their perspective would be wildly different than us looking into their world as people who are trying to follow the law insofar as they're able to without a temple and without all that stuff, right? And that's part of the great problem that is happening right now and has been happening since 70 AD, which is why after 70 AD, the schools of the rabbis really begin to take off. Because what do you do when your law demands sacrifice, when your law demands cleansing, when your law circles really around a temple or a tabernacle and you don't have it anymore? This is where we get, like, the rabbinic schools begin to really take off, and these ways of thinking about Torah really begin to take off. And again, like the chapter that I read part of says, some of us, we know some about how that world interpreted the law, and we read that back into the New Testament, and that's not the world of the New Testament. They still had the temple until 70 AD. The Gospels, you still had the temple, which is why Jesus is able to interact with people there. Jesus pronounces judgment on the temple, right? All these different things that happen around the temple, because they still have it. The temple falling in 70 AD blew up the system in a lot of ways, and they're still trying to figure out, what does this mean, right? Okay, I know that was a lot. Again, these are not meant to be like, let me tell you every single tiny thing and answer every single little question, of which they are all valid questions. This is more of like a get your feet wet, let's kind of throw a bunch of things at our brains and see what sticks. And so anyways, next week we will talk about, we'll get a little bit more into the Pharisees and why does Jesus have so many interactions with them, and why do the gospel writers always paint them as like these like antagonistic people, and what were they actually like? And then we'll also talk about why on earth does Jesus spend so much time dealing with demons and what is going on with that, and why does that matter, and why are they in the Gospels everywhere and they're not really in the Old Testament a whole lot, and where do they come from, and what should we think about that now? So that's kind of what we're doing next week, which is our final week. Again, 3 weeks, easy, just an hour each week. So let me pray and then we will be done. God, thank you for letting us be here tonight to talk about the scriptures and to talk about maybe some confusing things, but hopefully some things that shed light on your faithfulness and your consistency and your presence continually with your people. God, we love you and we trust you. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.